Fidel Castro is dead. Long live the controversy. Freedom fighter turned dictator. He ruled Cuba for 50 years. Reviled and revered in equal measure, he was an icon of the 20th century.
Y la revolución cubana seguirían luchando y seguirían resistiendo.
Good evening. El Comandante, the man who ruled Cuba for half a century, has died at the age of 90. His peaceful death stood in stark contrast to his turbulent life. He outlived hundreds of assassination attempts and brought the world close to nuclear war and the Cuban Missile Crisis. He outruled 10 American presidents. But his swagger on the world stage was matched by the dead hand of his oppression at home. The patriarch ensured high literacy rates and free universal health care, but opponents were locked up, killed, or sent into exile. Tears today in Havana, but cheers amongst Cuban exiles in Miami.
It is more festival than funeral here. They've taken to the streets to celebrate the death of a man the President-elect Donald Trump has today called a brutal dictator, and there are a few here who disagree.
And has former coach Barry Bonnell now become the Jimmy Savile of the football world? In the past few minutes, his club Crewe Alexandra has launched an independent review of the way it has dealt with historical child abuse. Cuba has declared 9 days of mourning for Fidel Castro. The revolutionary leader seized power in Cuba 57 years ago and soon found his communist instincts in collision with his giant US neighbor. And while Barack Obama said today that America extended the hand of friendship to the Cuban people, President-elect Trump dismissed Castro as a brutal dictator. This was the interruption to the television schedule that Cuba had feared but also expected. Raul Castro, the 85-year-old younger brother of Fidel, the man now in charge. He took to the airwaves, his voice hoarse with grief. He informed the nation stiffly that the founder of the revolution had passed away.
Sobre la organización del homenaje póstumo que se le tributará al fundador de la revolución cubana hasta la victoria, siempre.
Forward to victory, always, the battle cry from an age that had outstayed its welcome.
National capital in response to the call of Fidel Castro for
Fidel Castro captured the imagination like few world leaders. He entered the picture as the tall revolutionary romantic who made a career and a regime out of flicking cigar ash at Uncle Sam. Here he was with the poster boy of revolution, Che Guevara. Fidel left the picture having ruled his island with an iron fist and a dictatorial disdain for human rights for half a century. Soon I will be like the others, he told a tearful audience at one of his last public appearances.
Pronto seré ya como todos los demás.
He had outruled 10 US presidents, outlived an average of 7 assassination attempts for every year of his life, and outperformed just about everyone, here with Maradona. On the streets of Havana, news was slow to spread to a population where only the very old had known life without Fidel.
De hecho, tener un país, ser presidente de un país por tantos años, eso no lo va a lograr en el mundo nadie.
And this was the reaction in Miami, home of the Cuban exile community, many of whom had fled Fidel's fist of power. Cuba and America only 90 miles apart, but occupying different worlds. David versus Goliath, a complex, vexed enmity that during the Cuban Missile Crisis almost brought about the end of days. As Fidel faded in recent years, relations with America thawed, but not for all. President-elect Trump was economical with his tweet. On the left, many still prefer to talk about Cuba's healthcare and high literacy rates, less about the economic decay and sometimes brutal oppression.
There were problems, and there are problems, of excesses by all regimes. One doesn't excuse that. One does recognise the economic and social changes that have happened in Cuba as a result of the revolution of 1959.
Fidel Castro is dead. Long live his controversial legacy. He was a world leader who divided opinions like no other. A glamorous and heroic revolutionary to some, a brutal and misguided dictator to others. In 1953, Fidel Castro stood trial for violent revolt. In his defense, he declared to the court, "Condemn me if you will, history will absolve me." Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Miller looks back over his turbulent life.
The poisoned cigars never got him, the toxic wetsuit failed, as did the exploding shellfish, the LSD spray, and the beard defoliant. For half a century, El Comandante escaped 638 attempts on his life. Something less exotic felled him in the end. Fidel Castro once predicted history would absolve him. Now, the jury's out.
Nearly 1 million people gathered at the bidding of their new leader, Fidel Castro.
Con que la revolución cubana sabe también pelear y ganar batallas en este campo.
Fidel Castro was a revolutionary leader who we loved. He was not a Stalinist, he didn't come from that background, he was very open-minded, and the Cuban Revolution was a very joyous affair.
He was just another dictator. He never understood the concept of human rights. He never understood or embraced the principle of universal freedoms.
14-year-old Fidel, Fidelito, in 1940, photographed by his Jesuit teacher. That's him with the lollipop. The trademark cigars were still a few years away. He was an illegitimate child, not easy in deeply Catholic Cuba, unacknowledged by his wealthy father until he was 17. It was only then that he assumed his father's name and became a Castro. He read law at university in Havana. In those days, the Cuban capital was America's playground, run by the mafia, half casino, half brothel. The rest of the island lived in grinding poverty. From the eastern Sierra Maestra Mountains, Castro waged guerrilla war against the US-backed regime of General Fulgencio Batista and his mafia cronies. They were massively outnumbered. Pro-Batista loyalists were shown little mercy. Within 2 years, though, there was full-scale insurrection in Havana. The dictator was about to fall.
In the dawn hours of January 1st, 1959, from Havana Airport, Batista escapes in his private plane.
And the hysterical reception shows that Cubans would support just about anything he did.
The war now over, this is the day the Cuban Revolution truly started.
He certainly displays great eloquence and a powerful personality.
These were heady days in Havana. One young American diplomat saw it all.
As a symbol of peace returned to Cuba, they released a flock of white doves just before he began the speech. Now, most of the doves flew off in the air, but one landed on his shoulder and remained there throughout the speech. And there were people in the crowd dropping to their knees. I was watching at a friend's house and heard sort of a moaning behind me and looked around, and here was the cook. She was swaying, had fallen to her knees and was swaying. Because the white dove is the messenger of the Oshun, the Santeria gods, sent to indicate the anointed one.
Castro speaks to the nation, his beardless brother Raul among the listeners, and attacks those inside and outside of Cuba who have called him communist.
Initially, the revolution was not avowedly Marxist, more a nationalist war of liberation.
Down from the mountains, the conqueror comes.
Cuba and Castro became synonymous with revolutionary chic. Not hard with Ernesto Che Guevara at his side, now Castro's second in command. To Che, medic turned military tactician, Fidel Castro was the quintessential revolutionary leader. The presence of literary great Ernest Hemingway added to the romance and the glamour. In an America still fresh from McCarthyism and its witch hunts, Castro was viewed with deep suspicion. In the early days, El Comandante visited the land of the gringo imperialists.
United States people is very good people.
How do you like the American press?
What?
American press.
Yes, you the reporters are wonderful.
The jokey atmosphere was not to last long.
Cuba seems to have the same effect on American administrations that the full moon once had on werewolves.
Cuba must not be abandoned to the communists, and we do not intend to abandon it either.
The US formally recognized Castro's new government, but severed relations when American businesses were summarily nationalized. A total trade embargo was imposed, tightened repeatedly over the years. Castro proclaimed Cuba communist and turned to Moscow.
Cuban revolutionary troops such as these have invaded...
The CIA launched the botched Bay of Pigs invasion, fronted by Cuban exiles. A disaster for the United States and a PR coup for Castro. These, some of more than 1,000 Americans captured. In exchange for billions of dollars in subsidies, the island became a strategic ally of the USSR, 90 miles off the Florida coast.
The Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
For 13 dark days in October 1962, the world came within a whisker of nuclear annihilation. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The then Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev told Castro he'd like to put nuclear missiles in Cuba.
Castro's response was that they would accept them. Cuba would accept the missiles as sort of part of their duty to the socialist community, but that they should do it openly. But Khrushchev said no, they must do it secretly. Castro said he didn't see how they could get them in secretly, but Khrushchev insisted, and he was, after all, the senior leader, and so Castro went along.
Cuba found itself at the vanguard of the Cold War. The unkillable Castro outlasted 10 US presidents. Surviving all the assassination plots and the blockade, he turned defiance of Yankee imperialism into the core of Cuban national identity. Fidel Castro built a socialist state which attained the highest levels of adult literacy in the Americas. Healthcare for Cubans was impressive too, attaining infant mortality and life expectancy rates on a par with America at less than a 20th of the cost.
All the social reforms which they've pushed through have left a lasting impact. The fact that black, Afro-American and Hispanic kids from the States now come and get a free education at the medical universities in Havana, these are things which have left an impact on the Cuban state and the Cuban nation itself and won't be forgotten.
But for all the triumphs, Castro's regime brutally repressed political dissent and stifled free speech. The media, state-controlled, opposition parties illegal, gays and lesbians barred from joining the party, neighborhood spies on every block.
I met Castro. I have been with him. I had the chance a few years ago to negotiate successfully the release of 6 political prisoners. My opinion is that Castro is just like another dictator who treats his people and his country as his personal property.
Shortages, rationing, long queues for everything, acute deprivation, alleviated a little in recent years by tourist dollars. The US blockade, the repeated excuse for economic mismanagement. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Cuban economy collapsed too. Castro stopped any mass exodus, but, increasingly desperate, many Cubans fled Fidel's utopia on makeshift rafts, heading across the Straits of Florida. He carried on with his infamous 6-hour-long speeches, though, but as revolutionary fervor faded, so too did Fidel Castro. In 2004, he tripped and fell. 2 years later, he missed his own 80th birthday fiesta. Castro's state of health was a Cuban state secret. Occasional pictures emerged offering proof of life, such as comradely visits by the late Venezuelan president Hugo Chavez. In 2008, Fidel's younger brother Raúl took the helm. Everyone knows that old revolutionaries never really die. And so it was that at Nelson Mandela's memorial, something revolutionary happened. Barack Obama extended his hand to Raul Castro, a symbolic step towards reconciliation between the US and Cuba. Just over 1 year later, diplomatic relations were restored after 54 years.
I do not believe we can keep doing the same thing for over 5 decades and expect a different result. Moreover, it does not serve America's interests or the Cuban people to try to push Cuba towards collapse.
Just months later, the American flag was raised once again in Havana. For 5 decades, the Vatican had worked behind the scenes diplomatically to foster that reconciliation. And when Pope Francis visited Havana in the summer of 2015, he delivered a homily of peace in Revolution Square under the gaze of a giant mural of Che. Pope Francis sat down with Fidel, who gave the Jesuit pontiff a book on his insights on spirituality. He sought no absolution. Long ago, Fidel Castro had declared in a speech that history would absolve him.
He is a world figure. He's a towering figure. He's an historic figure. And I think his epitaph will probably be from this little country, this little island, that he triumphed over everything the United States could throw at him.
Fidel Castro, the last of the Cold Warriors, was a relic. Ever the recalcitrant revolutionary who built a Caribbean island into an improbable global brand.
Jonathan Miller reporting. Well, one place where there have been celebrations following Fidel Castro's death is in Miami, Florida. Jackie Long is there this evening. She joins us now. Jackie.
Well, if Fidel Castro reshaped Cuba, then he reshaped this bit of America too. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans fled here to escape Castro and to build a new life, and many of them took to the streets today to celebrate his death. Rumoured so many times before, but now it's real. News of Castro's death has brought little Havana to life. On the streets, not in mourning, but celebration.
This is something that we've been yearning for, frankly, that the good Lord take him. I mean, I guess as a convinced Christian, you're not supposed to want somebody to die, but you know, there was no other way to start on the road to real freedom.
For decades, Cubans fled here to escape and build a new life, so many never able to go back home. Now wondering what happens next in a relationship between Cuba and the US, which was beginning to change. 2 years ago, secret talks were followed by a historic phone call between Obama and President Raul Castro, Fidel's brother. The first time Cuban and American officials had had a formal conversation since 1959.
These 50 years have shown that isolation has not worked. It's time for a new approach. Today, the United States wants to be a partner in making the lives of ordinary Cubans a little bit easier, more free, more prosperous.
In Cuba, Raul Castro timed his address to coincide with President Obama's. A trip to Havana soon followed, making Obama the first US leader in nearly 90 years to visit the island nation. Donald Trump has threatened to reverse all of what he called the concessions Obama made in an effort to normalize relations with Cuba.
The United States should not prop up the Cuban regime economically and politically, as Obama has done and as Hillary Clinton plans to do.
Richard Perdiguera's family lost everything, leaving Cuba on one of the freedom flights of the 1960s. He hopes Trump continues to take a tough line.
There was a point 10 years ago exactly that they claimed that Fidel was dead, and my father was in his deathbed at the time. The last thing I said to him before he passed away 10 years ago was that Fidel was dead.
Would you like to see President-elect unravel essentially what President Obama has
Exactly, unravel. I think Donald Trump is a great guy. He's one of us, hard-working man, and I think he's going to maybe help us.
But John Jules has never been able to visit family left behind in Cuba. And he hopes this will mean closer ties, that today will change everything.
I feel good for my people, very good. I see everybody happy. You know, they deserve to be happy. It's been a long time.
The question, though, now is what happens once today's party is over. So the President-elect Donald Trump has phoned the mayor here today to express his solidarity with the Cuban people. Where he stands on specific policies on Cuba is far less clear, though. Back in March, he was talking about opening a Trump hotel in Cuba, saying he saw the potential of bringing Cuba back in from the cold. But then, as we heard, by October, he was talking about pushing back on some of President Obama's reforms, trying to improve relations between the two countries. So much is to be decided.
Jackie, in a noisy Miami, thank you very much indeed. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to the American writer John Lee Anderson, who was in Colombia. He's writing a book about Fidel Castro. I asked him what kind of legacy Castro leaves behind.
It's interesting that he dies at a moment in which the left appears to be in a kind of eclipse in the Americas particularly, and there is this populist right-wing wave spreading across the world, from Brexit to the no to the peace referendum here in Colombia in October to, of course, and probably most importantly, the election of Donald Trump. It's as if Trump represents the downsizing of history, while Fidel's life was the stuff of great epic, you know, from the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis and Khrushchev and Kennedy to Angola and South Africa and a myriad revolutionary causes in between. It's a big one, a big legacy.
It is indeed. And yet relations between the United States under Barack Obama and Raul Castro in Cuba were thawing over recent years. Was there always agreement between the Castro brothers about the rate of that thawing?
Fidel certainly made it clear since the rapprochement brokered by his brother Raul with Obama that he wasn't as sweaty-palmed about it as everyone else was. He was a bit churlish in his remarks about Obama's visit, about the brokering of the restoration of relations. He repeatedly, expressed his distrust of the Americans.
What of the future of those relations under President Donald J. Trump?
It could be that Fidel's death and the kind of revelry we saw in Miami amongst the Cuban Americans who've been celebrating it ever since could actually, give him heart to go full Monty and really please the Miami crowd. Or he may think that it's time to relent and be pragmatic. We'll have to see in the next few days.
He may feel that it's time to build a Trump casino in Havana.
I'm sure he's already penciled that down somewhere.
John Lee Anderson, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Good to be with you.
Now then, Crewe Alexandra Football Club has tonight announced an independent review of its handling of allegations of abuse of young players by a former coach more than 20 years ago. It came after one former director claimed that the club had been warned of the allegations at the time. Our sports correspondent, Kamian Zeram, has the story.
The nation's favourite sport, and the spotlight bearing down on Crewe Alexandra, where ex-players say convicted paedophile Barry Bennell may have abused hundreds of boys, and where senior figures reportedly held meetings about how to get him out, but they didn't.
Do you have faith in the club leadership?
I think the problem Crewe have got is that some of the leadership were around at the time. I know obviously, stuff's come up about Man City and Newcastle, but, we've got people in charge of the club who were there at that time.
So does this begin and end with football, or could it involve other sports? Indeed, anything where young people come into unsupervised contact with adults.
It is inevitable that there will have been similar forms of abuse in other sporting arenas, and inevitably, and at some point, those individuals will have the confidence to come forward and report their abuse.
At least 4 police forces are now investigating allegations of historic abuse, and Andy Woodward, the player who first spoke out, says another man who abused him at Crewe has never been brought to justice.
There was always 2 people that at Crewe, those 2 people, they need to take positive action, because there's a risk to the public out there, and there's a risk to people and there's a risk to children.
Few doubt there'll be more revelations, and tonight Crew Alexandra confirmed they're launching an independent review of how they dealt with allegations of child abuse going back decades.
We're back tomorrow at 6:30. Until then, that's Channel 4 News on the day that Fidel Castro has died. Thank you very much. Good evening.